Good morning, everybody. This is Beats for Breakfast. If you've played Hades, you're probably one of the many people who were blown away by how surprisingly excellent it was. It won both Best Indie Game and Best Action Game at the 2020 Game Awards. Needless to say, this game has proven to be a real gem. There are a lot of factors that contribute to why Hades is such a good game, and today, I'll be talking about one of those factors: how Hades handled early access in its development. If you use Steam as your preferred gaming platform, you've definitely seen some games up for sale tagged as early access. This means that the game is unfinished and that it is currently being worked on by developers. Early access means that players can buy and play the game before they're meant to be released. This also means that a lot of content and features intended for the finished game won't be there when you play. Needless to say, early access is a controversial topic among gaming communities, which I'll elaborate more on soon. Ideally, early access games will have content and features patched in throughout the game's development cycle, up until the game is finally finished. At that point, the game officially releases and leaves early access, now with all finalized content actually in the game. So, here's the obvious question: why would anybody release their game before it's ready to be released? On the surface, this seems like a really bad idea. Well, there could actually be multiple reasons that a developer would want to release their game early. The most well-intentioned reason to pursue early access is to get live feedback from real players as the game is being built. As a developer, you can only change your game up so much after you release it, if even at all. Getting feedback on what you make is critical for any creative medium, especially for games. Feedback shows you perspectives of your creation you'd never notice yourself, so it lets you improve whatever it is that you're making. Playtesting and quality assurance are common features of all game development cycles, regardless of if it's an indie game or if it's a big brand game. As a developer, you're in a position where you can never truly see your game the same way that normal players do. This is why getting regular people to test is imperative. A common mistake that creators make is that they only test their works on their close friends or other niche groups, so the feedback they receive ends up being biased and unrepresentative of the average player. Releasing a game in early access helps this issue tremendously. It means a much more diverse audience will actually be playtesting your game and giving you feedback. This audience may still not perfectly resemble the average player, but they're much closer to it than any other focus groups that the developer could summon for testing. These playtesters give their feedback so the developer can improve their game as they make it. Playtesting helps make a game a lot better than it otherwise would be upon finally releasing. This was definitely true in the case of Hades, since many changes and additions throughout the game's development cycle were inspired directly by playtesters. Some of these changes were even directly suggested to the developers by the community. So, why else would a developer want to put their game in early access? Another reason would be for money. When a developer releases a game early for a discounted price, it's pretty much guaranteed that some players will buy it. This money obviously goes to the developer and allows them to start earning some income prior to the game's release. Look, I know it's no big secret that games take a pretty long time to make. Based on my own understanding, the average development cycle of a game is somewhere around 3 years or even longer. This definitely depends on the game and the developer, but the basic idea that games take a long time to make still stands. To make a game, you need funding, mainly to pay people for working on the project. Established companies usually do have the funding already secured to make a game, so they don't tend to do early access most of the time for this reason. However, indie developers are different. Many indie developers don't have enough savings to finance their entire game, so they need other means of financing. Even if you're working as a one-person team, you still need money to live. Developers with no money might finance their game by taking out a loan, like the creators of Cuphead. They might try a crowdfunding campaign, like the creators of Hollow Knight or the creators of Shovel Knight. And obviously, some developers may try to release their game in early access, so they can start bringing in money to continue the project. Supergiant Games, the creators of Hades, had been around for 9 years when they first announced Hades in early access. Prior to Hades, they had released 3 other games. Up to this point, they had said multiple times that they had enough money to continue making games comfortably. Therefore, making some money was likely not a major driving factor for releasing Hades in early access. To recap, 2 of the most important reasons a developer would want to do early access would be for feedback and for profit. Supergiant Games leaned heavily into the for feedback category when it came to Hades. There may still be other reasons that developers want to do early access, like to help with self-motivation. However, we'll just be sticking with these basic reasons for this video. So, we know why developers would want to launch their game in early access. How do players respond to early access, though? Well, it depends on the individual person, really. Many take it well, and many don't. I mentioned earlier that early access tends to be a controversial topic in many gaming communities, and there are some valid reasons for this. At its core, early access is selling an unfinished product to consumers. Now, imagine if any other industry attempted to do this. If somebody tried to sell you an unfinished movie to watch, an unfinished song to listen to, or whatever else, you probably wouldn't be too happy about it. Sure, you still get to enjoy some of it, but it's still not finished. Even if the unfinished product is sold at a discounted rate, which it usually is, that still doesn't change the fact that it's not complete. Many consumers would understandably be upset with stuff like this, since many people will see it as polluting an industry with lower quality content. On top of this, some games have had a history of being in early access for a very long time, maybe even to the point where it seems like they'll never be finished. A big part of buying an early access game is that, in a way, you're also pre-ordering the finished game. If a game seems like it's never going to graduate from early access, it's very easy to see why a player would get very upset. Many people would see this as nothing more than a flat-out scam. With all these reasons, it's pretty obvious why many players would have negative reactions to early access. To a lot of players, early access games are just unfinished products on the market that may never be finished. So, how did players respond to Hades being launched in early access? Well, that's not the right question to be asking. Not the full question, at least. To explain, you'll need some context to how Hades exactly was announced. It happened at the 2018 Game Awards show, the same place that would go on to win 2 awards in 2020. Hades was announced as Supergiant's next game, and it was announced to be out in early access that very same day. But it wasn't on Steam. It was on the Epic Games Store. For those who don't know, the Epic Games Store is another PC gaming platform meant to be a competitor to Steam. It was a newer platform, and at this time, it was the subject of a lot of controversy in gaming circles. This is because Epic's idea of competing with Steam would be to contract developers to release a timed exclusive on Epic's platform. A timed exclusive meaning that the game would be out on Epic's store exclusively for a limited time before it was allowed to be released on Steam. Most PC gamers use Steam to play their games, and that was the source behind their frustration. Hades was in development for 1 year prior to being launched in early access. Supergiant took a contract up with Epic Games Store to have Hades released as a timed exclusive for 1 year while it was still in early access. After that point, they would go on to move early access to Steam. However, Hades was very different from most timed exclusives on the Epic Games Store, since this was an early access game. Why does being in early access make it special, though? Well, when Hades was first launched in this state, it had a minimal amount of content. It was pretty much a prototype. Remember, it only had a year of development up to this point. A few minutes ago, we established that the main reason you would want to release a game early would be to get player feedback. However, Supergiant had a more nuanced mindset. The earlier the game was in development, the less people they wanted playing it. This makes sense, since playtesters are still ultimately customers, and you don't want to saddle too many customers with an unfinished product. Starting early access on a new and less popular platform meant that Supergiant would have a smaller audience to start with Hades. After a full year of testing and updates, Supergiant would move on to push their game onto Steam for early access. The stars aligned in such a way where it makes the timed exclusivity with Epic Games seem like a silver bullet for the way Supergiant wanted to handle early access of their game. It still received ire from a lot of fans, including people who would post a negative review of Hades on Steam solely because of the Epic Games deal. However, I think a lot of the fans understood Supergiant's intent. Compared to finished games that were timed exclusives on the Epic Store, the backlash to Supergiant seemed a lot smaller. After being released to Steam, Hades would undergo 9 more months of development before finally being completed. At this point, we've talked about the big picture for the schedule Hades had in early access. However, we still need to talk about the smaller things. How did Supergiant Games exactly approach early access on a month-by-month basis? Well, to talk about this, we first need to make an analogy. Imagine a layer cake. Each layer is unique and adds taste to the cake. With all the layers together, you have a complete cake. Now, imagine slicing it. If you're a normal human being, you'll slice from top to bottom, cutting out a wedge for yourself. Let's call this vertical slicing. This way, you don't get to eat the entire cake at once, but you still get the experience of eating a full piece of it. Now, imagine you're a deranged psychopath. Instead of vertical slicing, you would slice the cake horizontally, cutting out one layer in a disc shape. Let's call this horizontal slicing. You now have a complete layer of the cake to yourself to eat, but you definitely won't enjoy it as much since the other layers of the cake aren't there to complement it. I know, this example is getting weird, but bear with me. Horizontal slicing and vertical slicing are two generalized ways to approach making a game. The full layer cake is an analogy for a finished game. The layers in the cake represent different layers of game development, from game design to programming to art to polish, and so on. The vertical slices of the cake represent individual levels in the game, since each level is a unique combination of all the layers of game development. Updates throughout early access in a game represent how you slice the cake. Many games go about early access by doing a mix of horizontal slicing and vertical slicing. You technically get your vertical slices of cake, but there are layers missing, usually in the form of polish or other non-critical things. As you serve the player more vertical slices, layers might be added on until the game is eventually finished and the game is ready to be released. When you add on these layers in future updates, you also give the player chunks of layers previously missing from the older slices they ate. Needless to say, this is a messy way to serve and eat a cake. Meanwhile, as Supergiant was making Hades, they were cutting the cake perfectly vertically. What updates they did make were fully complete and polished. Every time Supergiant would release a Hades update adding a new feature, it would feel pretty much done and ready for the final game, even if it technically wasn't. In fact, at many points throughout early access, I wouldn't blame you if you thought that the game looked already finished. Seriously, the level of polish with every single major update was something you just simply never see in any other early access games. On top of this, Supergiant was consistent with their update schedule. Every 1 or 2 months, they would release an update introducing some major feature like a new system, a new character, a new level, and whatever else. And like I just said, every major feature felt like it was pretty much ready for the official release of the game. I was personally there for about 75% of the early access of Hades. It was really exciting when a new update would drop. It didn't even really feel like early access, to be honest. It felt more like your favorite MMO game receiving a new expansion pack, except on a much smaller scale, obviously. All of the updates would be presented as if they were expansion packs. Each update would have its own special announcement graphic associated with it, showing off major features of the update in a very clean and professional way. On top of this, Supergiant would even start uploading videos of the in-game narrator reading the patch list for the update. In character, by the way.
Exalted Great Shield. Reduced health. The Minotaur starts fighting sooner once the encounter begins. Theseus adjusted his Poseidon Wrath variant. Increased spin attack recovery time. Chariot reinforcements reduced to 1 at a time. Other minor timing changes.
Every update would refresh my interest in the game, easily adding another 10 hours onto my total playtime. The fact that Hades is a roguelike game also helped this a lot, since at no point did it feel like an update was made to a part of the game that I had already finished and had no interest in revisiting. As mentioned earlier in the video, the main reason that Supergiant chose to do early access was to get feedback in real time as they made the game. And this did happen to a degree that can't be understated. Many changes and additions to the game were directly inspired by player feedback. When these changes did happen, they'd even be marked on the changelog as being a direct result from the community's feedback. So, now you know. By this point, I hope you understand what made the early access of Hades so special compared to the early access of most games. The Supergiant team made an excellent call with this, and I'm glad that they did, since Hades has lived on to become one of my favorite games of all time. Many players only started Hades when it officially released, and were surprised by how excellent the game was. If you were an early access player like myself, you weren't surprised, because you got to see that excellence being built up in real time. How Supergiant handled early access was innovative, creative, and polished. They didn't take the typical approach of neglecting players' enjoyment for most of the early access. Instead, they treated each update as if it was its own complete DLC pack, with player satisfaction as a priority. Moving forward, I sincerely hope that more early access developers take note of everything Supergiant did here. This has been Beats for Breakfast, and I hope you enjoyed.